the world is a very complicated place. Now, we've talked about this before. And the way that you handle, there's way too much complexity for you to handle in its entirety. So, for example, in a room like this, there's an endless number of phenomena that you could focus your attention on, right? From the sort of macro phenomena, which would be the overall, say, color or appearance of the room, to the micro phenomena, which would be the details at the highest level of detail that you're able to perceive that litter the landscape anywhere. And so one of the problems that you have to solve when you're operating in the world is how you perceive the world. And we do that in part by making, I would say that we perceive low resolution representations of the world, and we also confuse those with the world. So when I'm looking at you, I'm really looking at what I perceive consciously is a low resolution representation of you, right? I only see the front of you to begin with. I only see your surface. And in some sense, I even perceive you in some sense as a more or less uniform color. It's hard to tell exactly what color skin is. It's sort of a light pink, roughly speaking. But my perception is fairly, I don't know a better way of putting it than low resolution. And I seem to perceive you at the level of resolution that's sufficient, the lowest resolution that's sufficient to facilitate our interactions, because I don't want to clutter up my perceptions of you when we're just talking with excess detail. So there's lots of things about you I don't need to see. I certainly can't see any of your microstructures below the phenomenal level. Like I can't tell without tremendous further investigation what you're made of biologically, for example. And I certainly can't perceive the networks of society that you're engaged in, your family or the other sorts of networks that you're embedded in. I see you here now, the front of you, at low resolution. And you can tell that to some degree, and we've talked about this before, because if you see, say, animated movies that use very low resolution representations of people, like South Park's a really good example, because the animation in South Park's very iconic and simple. It actually makes almost no difference to following the story. And so that shows you how iconic your perception really is. It can be replaced by very simple icons, and you instantly adapt to that. And so we can go and see the Lego movie, the Batman Lego movie, for example, and the fact that it's Batman, which is an abstraction to begin with, and then it's made out of Legos, is almost irrelevant to following the plot. And so some people have compared our perceptions to the user interface on a computer. When you're interacting with your computer, you don't really interact, so to speak, with the computer. There are iconic representations on the screen of the computer that you interact with, and those represent, obviously, they share some functional relationship with what's going on in the computer, but mostly they're there so that you, using your perceptual structures, can interact with the computer in a manner that's easy for extremely intelligent apes, roughly speaking. Now, so one of the problems that you have to solve in the world, because it's so full of detail and so complex, is how do you actually see the world? How do you actually perceive it? And it isn't really self-evident that that's a problem, because you think when you look at the world that it just presents itself to you. But it's a tremendously complicated problem, and that's partly why developing artificial intelligence systems that can actually see the world and act in it in any real way has proved to be a much more difficult problem than people had originally supposed. Because we were told maybe from the early 60s onwards that such things as speech to text or object recognition or robots that could operate in the world were only 2 or 3 years away. And well, I mean, we're in a situation now where there are some fairly complicated robots built, but they're still really in their nascent form. And it's because perceiving the world and then figuring out how to act in it turns out to be a much more complicated problem than we originally thought, because the borders between things are not self-evident, and what level of resolution you should be perceiving things at for, say, maximal functional utility is also not self-evident. It's also tied up very strangely and in ways we don't understand with the nature of your embodiment. So, for example, we tend to see things that are handy because we can pick them up and manipulate them, and we can make use of them. And so to some degree, our brains are evolved to make the world manifest itself to us in a set of discrete usable tools. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it. And they're discrete and usable because we have a certain kind of biological platform, you know, because we have hands and mouths and because we walk in a bipedal manner, then it's logical for us to break up the world in a manner that makes operating in this body maximally useful. But that doesn't mean that there's a straightforward one-to-one relationship between our perceptions of things and the things themselves. Quite the contrary. And that's partly, of course, we know that because with any perceptible object, like I could conceptualize you as one thing for all sorts of purposes, but if I'm trying to solve a complex problem in relationship to you, it's going to be very difficult to determine how to conceptualize you. So if you come to me because you're suffering from a psychological problem of some sort, then I have to figure out, you know, is it organic? Is it there's actually something physiological wrong with you? And I need to know what level of analysis I would probably conceptualize you at. Is it psychological? And if it's psychological, is it functional? Like, do you lack the skills, or do you lack the ability to apply the skills? Or is there something really gone wrong with your family? Or maybe it's even a reflection of an overarching sociological problem. We know, for example, that when the unemployment rate goes up 1%, psychiatric hospitalizations go up 5%. And so then you might ask, well, you know, if there's a huge rise in depression and anxiety across the population, and at the same time there's a huge increase in unemployment, you have to ask yourself what level of perception would best be suited to solve that problem, because it isn't self-evident that it's psychological at the level of the individual. Anyways, my point is that perception is a very difficult problem. And so now here's something interesting. You can think about this for a minute. I went and saw an autistic woman speak at one point. Her name was Temple Grandin. She's really worth looking up. Temple Grandin is a very interesting person. She's very seriously autistic when she was a child, but her mother and her worked her out of it so that she's very functional. She works as a professor. I don't remember where. It's in the Midwest somewhere. Now, she's famous not only for being a highly functional autistic person who talks a fair bit about what it's like to be autistic, but also for designing slaughterhouses across the United States. And the reason she can do that, as far as she's concerned, is because she thinks like an animal thinks. And so she doesn't, and she's identified maybe at least part of what the core problem is with autism. So the talk I heard her at was in Arizona, and it was a really an entrancing talk. She showed some really interesting pictures of animals. So what she's done is she's redesigned slaughterhouses so that when the animals enter the slaughterhouse, they go in like a spiral, basically. They can't see what's around the corner, and the walls are high so they're not distracted by anything outside. So one of the things she showed, for example, was a bunch of cows going through a standard sequence of gates, essentially. And off to the side, there was a windmill spinning, and the cows would stop because the windmill, they didn't understand what the windmill was, and they'd stop. Or showed other pictures where cows were going down a pathway too, and there was a Coke can sitting in the middle of the pathway, and the cows would all stop because they didn't know what to do with it. Or she had another picture of cows out in the middle of the field, all surrounding a briefcase, and they were all looking at the briefcase. And the cows didn't like anything that shouldn't be there and had a hard time mapping it. Now she said, here's a little exercise she did. She said, think of a church. Okay, so maybe imagine a child's drawing of a church. It's like your standard house, like a pentagon, right? Which is basically how children draw the front of a house, with a steeple on top and maybe a cross on top of it or something like that, which actually isn't at church. It's an icon of a church. And you think about how children draw houses too. Pentagon, rectangle, what is it, trapezoid, chimney, almost always with smoke, which is quite interesting. I don't know where kids get that exactly, but they almost always draw a chimney with smoke, even though chimneys with smoke aren't that common anymore. But anyways, you know, you can see what a child's picture of a house looks like in your imagination. One of the things that you might want to think about is that is not a picture of a house at all, right? It's an iconic representation that's kind of like a hieroglyph, because no house looks like that. And then you think about how a child will draw a person. Circle, stick, 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 stick. And you show it to someone and go, that's a person. It's like, really? It looks nothing like a person, right? You immediately recognize it as a person, but it looks nothing like a person. Well, what Grandin said was that when she thinks of a church, she has to think of a church she's seen. She can't take the set of all churches and abstract out an iconic representation and use that to represent the set of all churches. She gets fixated on a specific exemplar. And she thinks that one of the problems with autistic people, and they have a very difficult time developing language, by the way, is that they can't abstract out a generalized representation across a set of entities. They can't abstract. And then and of course, if you can't abstract, then it's also very difficult to manipulate the abstractions. And you see very strange behavior with autistic children, for example. So they don't like people. And that's because people don't stay in their perceptual boxes. Like a human being is a very difficult thing to perceive because we're always shifting around and moving and doing different things. Like we don't stay in our categorical box. So autistic people have real trouble with other people. But they also have trouble. So for example, if your autistic child gets accustomed to your kitchen, let's say, and you move a chair, then especially if they're severely autistic, they'll have an absolute fit about it. Because you think kitchen with chair moved. They think completely different place. Because they can't abstract the constancies across the different situations and represent them abstractly. So I made this little diagram. I made this little diagram here to kind of give you a sense of what you might be doing when you're abstracting perceptually. And so you could say, think about something that's that complicated. It's sort of my model of how complex the world is, but the world is a lot more complex than that. But the world is made out of, everything is made out of littler things, and those littler things are made out of littler things, and so forth. And those things are nested inside bigger things, and so forth. And where you perceive on that level of abstraction is somewhat arbitrary. It has to be bounded by your goals. That's the other thing, is that your perceptual structures are determined by the goals that you have at hand. I mean, some of that's not completely true, because your perceptual systems also have limitations, right? There's things you can't see or hear even if you need to. So there are limitations built in, but within that set of limitations, you're still trying to tune your perceptions to your motivated goals. And that's also very useful to think about when you're trying to understand artificial intelligence, because for human beings, without goals, there's no perception, because there's no filtering mechanism that you can use to determine the level of resolution at which you perceive.